Welcome to the Talking Toughness series of podcasts, where we examine the mental toughness concept with guests from a wide range of sectors, illustrating that our mental approach to what happens to us and around us matters for all of us. Our guests come from the worlds of business and public service, education, social mobility, sport, and health. They all share their experiences and their observations about the factors that have enabled them to survive and to thrive on their journey through life. Many guests have gone further and incorporated the concept into what they do as coaches, trainers, managers, and leaders, helping others to thrive in their turn. Their experiences are valuable to those of us who strive to do the same.
Well, good morning, John, and thank you very much for giving your time to be with Peter Clough and myself.
Hello, Peter, and hello, Doug. It's an absolute delight to be here to chat with you both.
Well, I think we're delighted too. So perhaps we can leap straight into the topic of the day. And it's not going to surprise you that we're going to be talking about leadership. And I'm going to start with a question. We've always been engaged with leadership, and there's an interesting quote from two prominent North American commentators on leadership, Augier and Thies, who in 2005 said, "The theory and practice of leadership is a chaos." And to some extent, that's true. And if you do a search on leadership and definitions of leadership on Google, you literally get hundreds of millions of definitions.
Yep.
Now, we've known for donkey's years that leadership is important, and yet we're still sitting here asking the question, which I'm about to ask you, what is leadership?
Well, it's really interesting actually, because I'm just thinking about the Drucker quote. You know, only three things happen naturally in organizations: friction, confusion, and underperformance. Everything else requires leadership.
I like that.
It's quite interesting actually to think about the natural state of affairs is chaos. So it's inevitable that is the first thing that leadership would have to deal with, and I nearly said overcome, but actually I won't say overcome, because I don't think it's possible to overcome the inherent complexity or chaos of organizational behaviors and stuff like that. But definitely the first thing to try and get to grips with and to start to deal with. So I can't help thinking that in a way, one of the ways in which we almost implicitly, intuitively measure whether or not a person is a good leader is how chaotic or how organized their organization is. We sort of implicitly lay over them this template that says, well, if it's pretty chaotic, you're not really a very good leader. And I'd be interested actually to explore, obviously with you both and with everybody else, whether or not that's a valid approach to measuring whether or not somebody's a good leadership figure.
I think that's a really interesting perspective. That's really good, John. I don't think I've ever heard that. And it's interesting because Augier and Thies have actually also produced, that they're sort of semi-academics, a paper on Schumpeter and leadership. And of course, Schumpeter's the economist who writes about creative destruction. He says chaos produces advances. So
yeah, and actually I'm almost making this up as I go along, by which I mean actually this is triggering some very interesting thoughts in me. The process of advance in an organization, we often view that as being dependent or contingent upon the capability of the leadership, not an individual figure, but the capability of the leadership. That's what produces advance and progress in an organization. But actually, it would be interesting to explore, again, whether or not that is what leadership is for. Because it might be that leadership is actually just to get everything out of the way so that everybody else can produce the progress and the advances to allow creativity and innovation to flourish. But we still, I think, as a group of people, as a human race, we come back to this idea that leadership is about almost control and facilitating control of organizations. And I'm not entirely sure that that's a sufficient, let alone necessary, condition.
I think that's a really good point. I mean, as you know, I'll be 75 in a month or so, and I've been working since 1969. You know, most people listening, their parents wouldn't have been born when I started working.
Well, don't worry, Doug. My parents were definitely born, and I'm not entirely sure, but I think I was born as well.
Well, the very first thing that happened to me is I was sent to Rutherford College, which is now the University of Northumbria, to attend a course on leadership. My first employer did that, the very first thing they did. And the whole course was about F.W. Taylor's scientific management.
Yeah.
And that was the theory of the day. That's what leadership was about. That was, the idea is you worked out what should be done. You told people clearly what was expected of them. And as you say, control was the big thing. And even then, I doubted that. I couldn't understand that. I didn't like it applying to me for a start.
Of course, yeah.
And then, what we see now, and as you know, we've written this book, Who Cares Wins. Yeah. We see a completely different approach to leadership. We see leadership is about creating conditions for others in which they can thrive. Yeah. So we touch a little bit about things like intrinsic motivation. So I'm interested to know, having said what you've said, do you think we are on a journey to a different form or style of leadership?
I think absolutely yes. And I think not only are we on that journey from Taylorism and control through to actually relinquishing control, not just relinquishing, but deliberately giving to somebody else. That's what we mean by empowerment, giving somebody else control. Not only are we on that journey, I think we are a lot further along that journey than most leadership figures realize. I think most leadership figures are not even struggling to keep up. I don't think they've even recognized that the race has gone past them and is leaving them behind. And I think, we think about disruptive behavior, the classic concept of disruption, where something happens in the marketplace, a disruptor comes along, changes the situation, and the incumbents don't realize it until it's too late. I think that's what's happening in leadership terms right now. And I'd be interested actually to hear from Peter, because I mentioned this word control, and of course control is one of the 4 C's in the mental toughness model. And I think who was it? Was it Ted Turner who had a plaque on his desk that used to say "Lead, follow, or get out of the way"? Yeah. And that's quite an interesting acceptance that leaders need to do one of those 3 things, and it might be the third one. But I mean, Peter, do you think we are on a journey to giving up control?
Hopefully. The situation is we're on the edge of a paradigm shift, potentially. And I say that because before this podcast, I was watching 1950s movies, as I do, in black and white. And there was a structure and there was a predictability, both in the world and within society. That has changed fundamentally from this top-down to more involvement. But I agree with it. I don't think the leadership thinking has moved on. I'm still lecturing on master's courses at Hull University and still talking about Taylor. Because it's an element, and we get to where we are now, and something has changed. There's been a shake somewhere, but we haven't consolidated it. Wow. And I think that shows its face in things like diversity, where people understand the importance of it, but they're not really with it. If you think about diversity of thinking, people, quite a lot of leaders are not particularly comfortable with that idea. So if you go back to control in the mental toughness model, that's trying to control what you can control. Yeah. And I think what you're raising, a really interesting point, is control what you should control. 2 elements going on. So just because I could control it, should I control it? And I'm about to go out after this podcast to drive our miniature railway in Scarborough. That's the sort of guy I am. And it's coming down the hill. You let it go. Yeah. How much do you let it go? And I think it's that feeling as a leader of letting the culture go a little bit, but nudging it into the right direction. And I think that's a huge step, because it comes back to, I think people feel a bit threatened, because then what's a leader for if it's not? Yeah, what is leadership? What's a leader for if you're not telling people what to do?
Absolutely right. And this thing about locus of control, I think psychologists call it, the area of one's life that one feels control over. We often, I think, in the past have thought of locus of control as much as possible. I need to make my locus of control as big as possible, so I control as much of the influence on me as life can bring, as upon. But actually, as you quite rightly say, this should be almost a selectivity of control. In fact, not almost, definitely a selectivity of control, and maybe a willingness to relinquish control far more than we think we should. And I just pick up a second on that this idea of paradigm shift, because it's almost the opposite of a paradigm shift. If you think about a paradigm shift as the situation remains the same, we just change the way we look at it. What's happening now is the situation has changed radically, but actually many people still have the same mindset as they had before. And I'm not sure, because I understand from experience and engaging with people, I can probably approach the need for somebody to have a paradigm shift, to look at a situation slightly differently and talk to them about that. I'm not entirely sure how we talk to leadership figures about the fact that everything is different and they still remain sitting in the past. I think that's a much harder job to do.
Yep. And I think, you can coin a new term after the discussion, paradigm unshift. That's what we have.
Exactly.
But I think what has shifted, speaking as a psychologist, is because of COVID, what people thought was predictable and controllable wasn't. That had history, like in the World War, yes, things where people thought it was always going to be. But I think people have been slow to pick up within that locus of control. People now feel actually most things are outside of control. So this is a concern, because they want more control. And what's happening is, people are retiring early. They're controlling the controllables because they think, I can do that.
Yep.
But what I can't do is, because tomorrow we might not be here. There might be another lockdown, a war. All that stuff's going on, and it's riding that roller coaster.
It's fascinating.
And I think we can think a bit about it. And I think you're thinking about the control dimension. It is that leaders are often high on control, and it's targeting what they're trying to control. So
And it's interesting, because I think it's even the word control has, because of course you will know, language has such a powerful influence on how we think. And it was funny, somebody said to me once, how you think determines what you say. And I thought, actually, and it works the other way around. Because that biofeedback loop, if you like, what we say can actually influence how we feel when we say it.
It does, and your facial expressions. But when you think about control, I think it's an interesting area to explore. One of our concerns as we develop the mental toughness model is we'd like openness in control. What people are trying to do, what people are trying to say, and the mental toughness model, when we do academic research, doesn't link up to Machiavellianism. Right. Because the concern was, because what you provoked in my mind there when you're thinking is it's probably not sexy now to be positive about control. I think control still has some merit if it's how it's defined, but that might push it under the sofa. So people are still in control, but they're just pretending they're not. And that's the bit in leadership which has always frustrated me, is we value what you say as long as you say the right thing. I've done enough surveys in my time when the wrong answers come from the senior management point of view. Everybody loves us. No, actually they don't. So it's about, when we talk about control, riding the roller coaster, letting the organisation free will with direction. It's the thought that you then don't become underhanded, devious, making deals in back rooms. That's the bit which what you're saying is provoked in my mind. That's even worse.
Well, it's really interesting, because that I'm thinking now about this psychological contract, which is mentioned, of course, in the book. And this idea of a psychological contract being the unwritten contract between an employee and their employer. In a way, the expectations that the employee has about how they will be treated. And the interesting thing is, if leadership figures, if an organization is Machiavellian in the way it behaves and it becomes untrustworthy or unreliable, then it is in danger of breaching that psychological contract, those expectations of the employee. And because we don't know, because it's an unwritten contract, it's about expectations, we don't know what those expectations are until we're in breach of them. It's sort of becoming increasingly incumbent upon leadership figures to meet the expectations of employees almost before there's likelihood of breaching them. And that requires us to keep up with this shift we were talking about before in how leadership is delivered, if you like, because of how people expect it to be delivered. And I know one of the recent employees in the institute that I run, when I had a conversation with them just after they started working with us, one of the first things they said was, I joined the institute because of the values you represent. If you stop representing those values, I will leave. And I thought two things. First of all, what a tremendously courageous thing to say by an employee to an employer. I think it's fantastic. And secondly, what a commitment that represents on the part of that person. And I suspect there are a great many more people who feel like that than leadership figures imagine, let alone recognize.
Yeah, and I think picking up on your good point about language, you use the F word there, the feel word, how they feel about it. Because I was going to say, I think what's happening, which gives a clue of my background. But if you think about a psychological contract and an employment contract, an employment contract is a thinking, structured thing. A psychological contract is a feelings-driven thing, which it just feels wrong. You just feel let down.
Yep.
And that feelings element is a bit many leaders seem to be uncomfortable with. Let's keep feelings out of this. And it's been the core of industrial disputes since time began. But it's not about fact. It's about feeling. If you feel you're badly treated, you feel you're badly treated. You can't tell people. So all that feelings stuff is mooshing around in a way. If we can use that productivity, back to that paradigm shift or paradigm ownership, and get into that emotionality and recognizing that emotionality and feelings have got equal weight to thinking and structure. I think we started off, and it's that's where we're talking about the shift, because too many of my generation use the term snowflakes, or problem with young people is they express their feelings, and you think it could be the problem with the older people, but they don't express their feelings. I can flip it, because we don't find that younger people are any less tough. It just manifests itself differently. They want to feel part of an organisation, not think they're part of an organisation. You can have a badge and a tie. That doesn't do it.
Yep. That's absolutely fascinating. And I'm thinking about an analogy that somebody used when we were talking about agile finance, strangely enough. And they talked about the difference between traffic lights and roundabouts. And they said a traffic light is a rules-based system. The rules are very, very clear. It's red, and then it's red and amber, then it's green. Everybody knows what the rules are. A roundabout is a values-based system, because actually everybody has to understand how a roundabout works and then allow it to work effectively and efficiently, because there are no traffic lights on a roundabout, or at least not on the good ones and stuff like this. So actually, maybe we are moving towards and in fact have already moved a long way towards a values-based leadership model rather than a rules-based one. So Taylorism would be rules-based, and whatever we're talking about now is actually values-based. And I really like that analogy, because I can understand traffic lights and roundabouts, you see, because I drive a car, so I know what they are.
No, it's a great analogy, which I will borrow and credit appropriately. But the other thing about roundabouts is they're scary. Traffic lights. more
Absolutely.
predictable.
Roundabouts are to a degree are unpredictable, of course, and scary because of that, because actually they rely upon somebody else sharing the same values. And that actually is a reflection of real life. And that analogy can be applied definitely to organizations. We could have, and many organizations I've worked with have innumerable policies and rules and structures and budgets and all this sort of stuff. And actually, if they're inefficient or ineffective, the people who work in that organization will always find a way around them to deliver what the organization needs to deliver. So the rules will often get in the way of effective delivery, whereas agreement on the values and the outcome that the organization wants to achieve can actually be much more creative. Which brings us back to something I think you said earlier, which was around, or Doug said, the role and the purpose of leadership. Actually, and I had a very interesting conversation with somebody once about the difference between the role and the purpose. And I said, well, the role of leadership, I'll go back to Drucker again, is to create more leaders, that which is a perfectly good way to describe the role of leadership, if you like. For me, the purpose of leadership is to achieve an outcome that cannot be better achieved any other way, because otherwise somebody else should be actually in the leadership position. And we had about half an hour of argument about that, and I'm quite sure that we could do the same.
Well, you're actually raising a really interesting point, because nowadays I don't do much delivery, but I shan't name the client. I'm actually working with a client, and almost the first thing I had to do is to clarify for me and for them the difference between a leader and leadership. They actually asked me to come in and contribute to a leadership program, but the language they were using wasn't about leadership. It was a succession planning program. So how do you see the difference between the term leader and what people seem to mean by the term leader and leadership?
I think the very first standout difference for me is the personalization of the word. So leader is a person, an individual person, and it's somebody implicitly, I'll go back to this thing about language, implicitly it's someone to whom we look up metaphorically because they have more experience, more wisdom, more knowledge, more whatever it is, more ability. And actually, all of those other quite good technical things, competencies that leadership actually requires in people to get credibility and stuff like that. So the leader is a person. Leadership is I suppose the simplest word is a function, although that doesn't really encapsulate everything about it. It's a behavior. For me, that's how I would describe leadership. It's a discernible behavior. And I think you can tell by the way that I'm floundering around here, it's very difficult to actually define what behavior would characterize leadership. Because
again, that's back to our opening phrase about how it is difficult. I mean, I tend to see a leader as a role, and a role in which we have an expectation of leadership. I see leadership as a set of behavioral qualities that anybody can provide. We don't necessarily expect leadership from people lower down in an organization, but we very often see it. And it makes a big difference. And that, I think, ties back into culture. And I'm sure there's another Peter Drucker quote you can use here.
Well, I actually won't go to Drucker for this. I have read other people. The culture is I remember having conversations about this, very often described as the way we do things around here. That's a nice encapsulation of culture. I remember actually thinking, if the culture is a negative one, actually the culture could be described as the sum total of all the barriers to progress in that organization.
Wow.
And I'm quite fond of turning things on their heads, really. We see culture as what's a bad culture look like? It's much easier to define that than what does a good culture look like in simplistic terms. And actually, if we define, if we go into an organization or we work in an organization, we think this culture is awful. Ask the question, how? What's wrong with it? What makes it a bad culture? Because actually, if we start then writing down the things that make this a bad culture, everybody's horrible to everybody else, it's too competitive, everybody keeps secrets, all of those other things, actually reversing each of those would reverse the toxicality of that culture. And it's one way to look at how do we improve the culture in an organization, actually simply define the problem.